Hello everybody, and welcome to our second edition of Bread Garden Market's Cheese Club. The great Affineurs of France is this month's topic. So we're going to be exploring the brief history of French cheese making. Then we're going to go into what exactly an Affineur is, what they do, and then get into some really delicious cheeses. So I guess first, let's, in very broad strokes, talk about the history of cheese in France. The French, before anyone else, elevated cheese into a true art form. They were making fantastic cheese even before there was a France, even before the Romans settled the territories of what we now know as France. Varietals or types of cheeses like Assurate, Cantal, Salers, even Roquefort date back pre-Roman to Roman times. And then cheeses like Apois and Brie have been around at least since the Middle Ages. There's a lot of evidence that Brie or Brie-style cheeses existed even before that as well. So because they've been doing it for so long, the diversity, the different types of cheeses, the amount of cheeses made in France is just really staggering, especially for the size of the country. When you compare it to a country like the United States in terms of volume produced. In the late 1930s, Charles de Gaulle once quipped to Winston Churchill how impossible it was to govern a nation that had over 320 different types of cheeses. And Charles de Gaulle was actually underselling that a little bit. Honestly, the French, there's no exact number, but food writers, cheesemongers, cheese experts put the number of French cheeses produced in terms of number of individual types somewhere between 500 and 700. So we're talking about an incredible amount of diversity. So whenever we're talking about the great cheese producing countries in the world, France is the benchmark. Has to be talked about in the conversation as greatest cheese producing nation in the world, and it's just a monster. Most of what we produce in America, in terms of what we consider artisanal cheese, gets some sort of inspiration and influence from France and French cheese making. So a lot to cover, obviously. I can spend a whole year doing classes just on French cheese, but we're going to kind of narrow it down, get a little bit into specific history, and then get into the main topic, which is Great Affineurs of France. All right, so let's run down really quick history of French cheese. All right, we had already mentioned earlier that a lot of cheeses like Cantal, Assurate, Roquefort, or at least cheeses that resemble those cheeses that we know of as those cheeses today, predate Roman times, were certainly prevalent in Roman times. Pliny the Elder writes about cheeses that resemble what we now know as Roquefort, which we now know as Cantal. So they've been around at least that long. There's some archaeological evidence that suggests a lot of those cheeses have been around even further than that. Brie, Camembert, probably more around the Middle Ages. Charlemagne was a huge fan of Brie and wrote about it, or had his scribes write about it. They were always pretty prevalent early on at Parisian marketplaces. Bries and Camemberts were really the first, or one of the first, farmstead cheeses, and had always been, up until the Industrial Revolution of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, they had always been small farmstead cheeses. From a practical standpoint, Bries were always easier to make than, say, Comté, for example, or Abondance. You don't need a lot of cows to make Brie. You don't need a lot of goats if you want to make a goat Brie to make Brie. So it takes a relatively small amount of milk. And if you're a farmer of not so great means, the separation of wealth back in the Middle Ages was even steeper than it is now. So if you weren't a mannerly lord and you were a serf, or you were a small farm owner or a small merchant, you would likely have only a few animals. You would have a few cows, you might have a few sheep, and you certainly would use the milk but to drink and other things, but you'd also use it to make cheeses, and they would make Brie-style cheeses. Basically, all they're doing is they would milk a cow, say at night, let the milk sit overnight. So what happens is the milk begins to sour and it begins to curdle. So in essence, we're talking about the proteins, the solids separating from the whey. Cheese is just essentially controlled spoilage in a lot of ways, and in its kind of truest form. So basically, it curdles, so the solids start to separate from the whey. Then they would take milk from the morning, pour that on top of the milk from the evening, but because you had all that bacteria starting the night before, you would start to get cheese. Curds would arise, very soft. They would just kind of take them out, put them in simple molds, find a somewhat cool but fairly humid place to store them, and you press it a little bit. 4 or 5 days later, you have some fresh farmer's cheese. If you wait another 5 to 7 to 10 days, you would start getting what now resembles brie and camembert. So brie and camembert were essential parts of life for serfs and small farmers. The monasteries during the Middle Ages became huge cheese producers. Monasteries, unlike individual families, had quite a bit of land, and usually a decent amount of money too. And along with this, they had farms and lots of cattle or sheep, but usually cows. And during times of, when they couldn't eat meat, so like Lent, where you give something up, or in the cases during the Middle Ages, there would be periods of time throughout the calendar where monks would have to forego certain food items and kind of sacrifice. So they would make other sources of protein like cheese. And some of the cheeses they would make were like Epoisse, or what you would call Chimay cheeses. Chimay is a very famous brand of beer, but Chimay is also a type of cheese. And basically, cheese and wine production and cheese and beer production during the Middle Ages went hand in hand. So you had, typically at a monastery, you would have someone making beer or making spirits or even making wine. And during times of sacrifice or during times of, and I keep saying sacrificing, what I'm talking about is fasting. So during periods of fasting, when monks couldn't eat meat, they would use cheese as an alternative. And why beer production, wine production, and spirits production went hand in hand is often when these monks were making these cheeses, they would wash them in whatever alcohol that monastery made, or multiple types of alcohol that monastery made. So when you wash a cheese in alcohol like beer or wine or spirits, beer and spirits being the more popular option for French monasteries at least, you create a certain environment for certain types of bacteria to flourish, and you get kind of very complex, soft cheeses that have like an orangish rind that smell quite pungent, and those are washed rind cheeses. So washed rind cheeses come from, all evidence points to the monasteries and washing these cheeses in beer and other types of alcohol. So that's kind of your stinky cheeses. People say, that cheese smells like feet. They're usually talking about washed rind cheeses, because those, the same, believe it or not, bacteria that we find on our feet, one of the types is Brevibacterium linens, or B. linens, that are prevalent, are also prevalent on those types of cheese. And it's that alcohol that creates that kind of environment for those types of things to thrive. There are hundreds of other types of microflora and bacteria that develop on these cheese. So you're literally not eating feet cheese. That's ridiculous. But if you smell those cheeses, and those are some of my favorite cheeses, you know what people are talking about when they say stinky cheese or foot cheese. So that's Middle Ages, brie, Epoisse. Also during the Middle Ages, you had the birth of great goat cheese making in the areas we now know as France, southern France, southwestern France, and then migrated up through the Loire Valley. It was actually the Saracens in around the 8th century who first brought goats into France, particularly in the southwest. And as goat herders migrated north, you had more and more goat cheese being produced. And a lot of those areas, like the Loire Valley, where a lot of people migrated to with their goat herds, are still some of the most incredible producing areas of goat cheese in the world. Loire Valley goat cheese, incredible. And we're actually going to have one a little later in the session. So that's a brief history in terms of going back ancient times through the Middle Ages and kind of where some of these cheeses came from. Of course, over time, cheesemaking has evolved. Different types of cheeses have been created. But the start, in terms of where they began thousands of years ago, and it's had thousands of more years to evolve and diversify and of exploration into new and different types of cheeses. So in terms of the breadth of cheese in France, we're talking about a history that dates back 3, possibly 4,000 years. All right, so let's jump into the cheeses now. So our first cheese, it's a little bit of a cheat. It's actually kind of the first producer is Affineurs and producer in one. It's actually a very small producer. The producer is Fermier de Jouvence. They make Bries and Camemberts particularly, and they're real traditional farmstead cheesemakers. And one of the few small farmstead cheesemakers that we're able to get a hold of here when it comes to Camembert and Brie for that matter. The Camembert and Brie that you may experience in France, especially in and around the areas of Brie and in Normandy, are very different than the ones we get here in the United States. Camembert in general is similar to Brie. They're both bloomy rind cheeses, and by bloomy rind they have this kind of white exterior. When the cheeses are fresh, it looks like there's a bloom on the cheese. When I get fresh Brie in, for example, it looks like almost like a fresh snow powder. Like if you've ever been skiing, when you get fresh powder, that almost is kind of covering the cheese. And as I get a little more aged, the powder essentially is a mold, so Penicillium candidum or Camberti dissipates, and you're left with this kind of white mold-ripened cheese. So they're both the same cheese in terms of its base. Camembert tends to be a little funkier than Brie, a little more pungent, a little more earthy and funky, especially on the nose. Unlike Brie, Camembert, some Bries come in these little rounds here as well, but Camembert always comes in these rounds. They're always 250 grams, I think like about 8.8 ounces, 9 ounces. Brie could come in different size wheels. Camembert always comes in this little packaging that's always the same weight. In France, traditional Camembert and Brie are both made using unpasteurized milk, raw milk. In the US, that's not allowed. It's illegal here in the US, according to FDA regulations. We can't have raw milk in the US, but raw milk cheeses in the US have to be aged 60 days or more to be sold in the US marketplace. Bries and Camemberts age at most 4 weeks, so they fall under that. So the Bries, I know we're gonna have Camembert here in a second, but the Bries are much closer in France to Camembert in terms of kind of funky, farmhouse, earthy, mushroomy style than we get here in the US. Both Bries and Camemberts in the US that come from France tend to be a lot creamier, a lot more buttery, a lot more mild than what you would get in France. That being said, the closest thing we have to traditional farmhouse Camembert or Brie in France comes from Fermier de Jouvence. So let's taste the Camembert here. I opened this up 20 seconds ago, and when I opened it, the aromas and scents of the cheese just came right out of the paper. It just kind of bowled me over. It's kind of vegetal and funky and earthy and grassy and a little barnyardy even. And then the smell kind of dissipates after a while. If you smell the cheese, it's not super funky, but there is some funk there, which I personally like A lot of woodiness, a lot of creaminess. I'm a wine person, so you'll notice I smell everything I do. You're lucky I'm not swirling my cheese right now. So, wow, really good. You almost get a little bit of, so the creaminess is there, the woodiness is there, really woodsy. That's actually really excellent. There's a little bit of vegetalness to it, but it's more woodsy than vegetal. And it's almost got like a slightly garlicky mustard finish to it. Let's actually, yeah, man. That's great. That's great. And then it definitely gives you an idea of what true camembert is. A lot of complexity, a lot of flavors going on. People who are used to the buttery, mild stuff, it might take you a second to get used to this, but not me. I love this style of cheese. It's just great. And, you know, like brie, camembert can go well with, you could put fruit spread on it if you want to do like a sour cherry or a fig jam. You can bake brie too, which is awesome. Most all of these wooden crates or little wooden, not wooden, but boxes that, or rounds that the camemberts come in are heat proof. So if you wanted to, you could bake your camembert like you would bake a brie right in the container. If you don't feel comfortable, put it in another container. You don't have to wrap it in dough either. Like people use phyllo dough and they'll wrap it, put stuff in it. That's great. But for something quick, you want to put like a little jam, some sort of fruit preserve on top or fruit spread. Throw some candied walnuts or candied pecans on there, caramelized nuts of some sort. That's all you need. Put it in the oven for 20 minutes, 30 minutes at like 300 degrees, cut into it, oozes out. It's a great, easy snack. Fermier du Jouvence Camembert. They are both cheesemaker and Affineurs because they age their own cheeses. It's delicious. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Our next cheese comes from one of the truly great Affineurs in France, Pascal Bolivar. Pascal has been around since the early 1980s. He's kind of ventured into some cheese production himself and other things. He makes yogurt, butter, cream, and some goat cheeses, and now owns retail shops, you know, from Paris to London. But his primary operating function is as an affineur, and that's how he started, and that's what he's still known for today, is aging great cheeses. He ages cheeses from goat cheeses to sheep cheeses to cow milk cheeses, but really his goat cheeses are what stand out to me. From this really nice fresh chèvre that we're gonna taste, or that you're gonna taste at some point here in the next few weeks, hopefully, if not today or tomorrow, to aged goat cheeses, to beautiful truffled goat cheeses, to ash ripened goat cheeses. They're all just delicious. He makes a beautiful goat cheese that's shaped like a bell that we carry around the holidays that I just absolutely love. It starts off nice and kind of cakey and a little firm when it's young, and then when it gets older, it gets like kind of nice and ripe outside of the, right outside of kind of the creme line, and it's just absolutely delicious. So if you see a cheese from Pascal Bolivar, whether you're here in the US or you're over in France or someplace else, pick it up without hesitation. It's always going to be delicious. I decided to go with just a simple fresh chèvre. I love chèvre. It's so versatile. You can cook with it. You can put it in eggs. You can make an omelet with it. You can just kind of spread it over a bagel or toast in the morning. You can use it as a snacking cheese. You can whip it up and combine it with honey, and it makes kind of a great spread. Yeah, you could even do some goat cheese-based pasta sauces, which are absolutely delicious. And Pascal Bolivar does a whole line of fresh chèvres, and this one that you're getting is the garlic and herb. Pascal does not kind of mince, he doesn't cheap out on the garlic and herbs. It is pretty profound garlic flavor you'll get out of this. But the chèvre is definitely or the chèvre. Chèvre is the correct way to pronounce it, by the way. But the chèvre is really the star of the show. Creamy and tangy and just super delicious. I'm not going to taste this cheese on the video here. I've actually always, whenever it comes into the store, I always have one of these in my fridge at home. And it's just a wonderful, versatile cheese that is absolutely stunning. And again, Pascal Bailliver, we carry anywhere from 1 to 5 of his cheeses, depending upon the time of year and how available it is. With COVID, unfortunately, some of the availability of his cheeses have kind of dissipated a little bit. It's been really hard to bring stuff over from France, especially during certain periods of the pandemic, unfortunately. But we're still able to get some of his delicious cheeses. And around the holidays in the fall, we're at peak Bailliver. We have about 4 or 5 different cheeses from him, and they're all absolutely fantastic. If you have any questions or if you ever want any of his other cheeses, we could usually order them, so don't hesitate to reach out. But enjoy this cheese. It's great on toasted bread, great on crackers, great on a bagel. I love it in eggs. Do what you want with it, as long as you enjoy it. That's what's important. Next up, we have a really special treat, and one of 2 cheeses from Master Affineurs Rodolphe Lemonnier. Rodolphe Lemonnier is truly a master. Back in 2007, he was literally given the title as best cheesemonger in the world. That same year, or the year after, I think, he was given a special medal in France that named him the best craftsman in all of France. So not even the best cheesemaker or the best affineur or the best cheesemonger, just the best craftsman, period. And it's well deserved. He is probably in terms of discovery, favorite affineur in all of France. He does some really traditional to really off the wall stuff. And like I said, we're gonna try 2 of his cheeses today. So the first cheese we're gonna do is the Marotte, a tome brulee. Tome just refers to like it's just a shape. It's a small, rounder cheese. There's tome de chèvres. There's all types of tome de Savoie. There's all types of tome cheeses out there. And basically, if you say tome, you're just referring to a shape, not necessarily a particular style. Some could be somewhat soft, some could be somewhat firm. They could be cow milk, they could be sheep milk, they could be goat milk. It's just a generic term for a certain size and shape. So the Marotte Brûlée, this is from the Pyrenees. It's a sheep milk cheese, being from the Pyrenees. And basically it starts off, it's just a baby brebis, or brebis. I don't know how to pronounce, my French is terrible. You people should know this by now. But basically brebis is a small, essentially it's a small assurate. It's a small sheep milk cheese from the Pyrenees. And then, as the term, it's backwards again, brulee indicates, he literally brulees the little petit brebis cheese. So he literally burns it. Like think of, someone taking a little bit of custard and taking a little blowtorch and caramelizing the sugar on top. That is what he does to not the inside of the cheese, to the rind of the cheese. So he literally scorches this cheese. And you kind of see, there we go, some good scorching, some good scorch marks kind of in and around the cheese. And you can see there's a lot of activity going on this rind. But basically he's taking a really great sheep milk cheese and just scorching it a little bit. It sounds more unique than it is, maybe. It's kind of, it does affect the final cheese flavor, but more in subtle ways. The cheese is kind of nutty. You do get some butterscotch and caramely flavors from it. But a lot of those flavors are just flavors you would get from that cheese even before he torched it or bruleed it. What the bruleeing does is it just kind of expands those flavors. It just kind of brings more of the natural flavors of the cheeses out. And because he's just doing it to the rind, you're just getting kind of an amplified flavor profile of what that cheese usually is. So simple, but really kind of brilliant in a way. So I magically got myself a little piece of this, cut into that wheel. You can see the color It's basically the same color the cheese would be without scorching. The cheese isn't aged, it's aged for a period of time, but usually only about 5 to 6 months, sometimes even a little less. And yeah, that's, so like nice, almost like hazelnut, brown butter, definitely caramel, butterscotch, and then a little bit of earthiness to it. That smells good. It's a lot of chewing, more than I meant to do, but you really want to chew that cheese. Whoa, you definitely get some of that toastiness on the palate. It's almost like a pepperiness to it too. You get like a little bit of a spice kick, and then definitely some of that buttery. Yeah, wow, that's really quite nice. So, Rudolph Lemonnier, Morat Brûlé, really a fantastic sheep milk cheese that he just torches a little bit. I would just snack on this. I don't know what else I would do with this cheese other than just snack on it. I mean, you could put it on sandwiches if you want. It's just, I think it's too special of a cheese to mess around with too much. You can use it in cooking, but I would just snack with some toasted bread, maybe some roasted red peppers or something. But man, that's got some strength to it. Excellent cheese. It is a natural rind. I wouldn't eat the rind though. And you might smell slight ammoniated flavors. You might smell a slight whiff of ammonia on the rind, which is somewhat normal. If it's totally ammoniated, that's not something you want. But you're really worried more about what the paste is like. But I wouldn't eat the rind. It would be unpleasant. It would be chewy. Wouldn't make you sick, but not something I would recommend. So, Rudolph Lemonnier, Morat Brûlé, enjoy it. Now, you can't have a proper French cheese tasting without getting a traditional Alpine style cheese in there. So we're gonna have a mountain cheese with our last cheese, a Tome Brûlé. It's from the Pyrenees, which is a great cheese producing region, but not super traditional because of the scorching, the bruleeing of the rind. So I wanted to get a traditional mountain French cheese in here, and in particular an Alpine cheese. Of course, the most famous is France's national cheese, which is Comte. I want to do something a little different. There are lots of other cheeses made in this region, but in terms of traditional Alpine, my two other favorites are probably Beaufort and Abondance. And so how I chose between the two was quite simple. Beaufort comes in 250-pound wheels, and we aren't quite set up to handle that kind of volume for one wheel. We'd get through a quarter of it before we'd have to start finding other ways to use it. So it would have been a waste, sadly. And Abondance, thankfully, comes in about 18 to 20-pound wheels, so much more manageable and equally as delicious, but also quite a bit different from Comte in terms of flavor profile. So it's a really good one to have. The name Abondance comes from the type of cow milk they use. The breed of cow is called Abondance. The cheese is Abondance, real simple. That happens a lot with French cheeses. Solaires is the other one that comes to mind. Solaire cheese is named after the breed of cow, but it happens in other countries as well. Manchego is named after the Manchega sheep where the milk comes from. So Italy does some of the same stuff. So you get like Vacche Brune, Parmigiano Reggiano, because it's Vacche Brune milk. So anyway, Abondance cheese is made from Abondance cow milk. Pretty simple. It comes from Savoie in particular. So some of you had the Wine Cache Wine Club with the Cheese Club. You had a delicious little white from Savoie. So we're talking about the same region here. And this is also aged by Rodolphe Lemonnier. So the guy we had, the Tome Brûlé cheese, also does this delicious Abondance cheese. So Abondance is kind of semi-firm. It's pretty pliable, has a similar texture to Comte or Gruyere. It has to be aged at least 100 days before release. So we're not talking about a lot of aging here. You get some Comtes that could be aged for over a year, sometimes more. Abondance can be aged longer than 100 days. That's the minimum. But typically they are about 4 to 6 months in terms of age. But that kind of aging, that length of time, does really start to develop a lot of nice secondary flavors out of the cheese. So you get some of the same notes we got from the Tome Brûlée. You certainly get a little nuttiness. I don't get that burnt kind of edge to it, that spiciness. A little fruity. There's certainly kind of a little bit of that brown butter. So the palate on that guy is amazing, and a little different from other Abondance cheeses I've had before. The Le Meunier Abondance. I mean, I said nutty, and usually when you're talking about Alpine cheeses being nutty, you're talking about like hazelnuts, maybe a little almond, brown butter. This is like super good roasted peanuts. I mean, if cheese was really good, fresh roasted peanut butter, it would be this cheese. It's really kind of unique. I've never had an Abondance that has quite that intensity of roasted peanut flavor, and it's really cool. It sounds a little weird, but it's actually delicious. Kind of the texture with that combination of flavor is really outstanding. Man, so that's really good. So, taste it for yourself. See what kind of flavors you get, but that roasted peanut was definitely kind of what stood out most to me. And delicious cheese. And now we'll move on to our last cheese, but certainly not least. Now, last but certainly not least is our Roquefort, specifically from a producer and Affineurs cheese ager, Carles, C-A-R-L-E-S. I know there are a few of you out there who have been to the classes and other things that don't particularly like blue cheese. I don't know what happened to you in your previous life or what kind of childhood tragedy made these unfortunate circumstances so. I wish I can go back and change them for you. I love blue cheese. Blue cheese is one of my favorite styles of cheeses. They're very versatile. You can make dressings and sauces with them and put them over steak and do all sorts of things. But I just love snacking on blue cheese in general. I do, all kidding aside, understand how some people are turned off. It's riddled with mold. Penicillium roqueforti. It's very strong and pungent a lot of times. But I find when I give people who say they don't like blue cheese, high quality blue cheese like this Carles Roquefort, that it does change some people's minds about blue cheese. And that's kind of what we're about. Exploring, looking into great cheeses, and then, maybe you just haven't had good blue cheese. Maybe you have and just don't like blue cheese, and that, in all seriousness, is fine as well. So Roquefort is one of those ancient styles of cheeses that have been around forever, at least back to Roman times. As I mentioned, Pliny the Elder wrote about a cheese very similar to what is Roquefort. The birth of Roquefort is very unique. The legend goes that there's a French farmhand who left his cheese and rye bread aside and fell into a bag while he went to go hit on a young lady across the way, and he forgot about it, and what he pulled out was this moldy cheese, which eventually became Roquefort and blue cheese. That's not true. That's apocryphal, obviously. How would anybody know that? But It is, in a lot of ways, blue cheese is a fascinating style and type of cheese, because essentially the spores or the molds that are being used to make blue cheese are, and specifically here, Roquefort, are a specific type of rye bread that come from that region. So traditionally, what you would do is you would purposely mold rye bread and then kind of harvest the mold, and that's what you would use to inoculate your blue cheese. Now, you just can't add the mold to the cream or the milk and then expect it to be blue cheese. It would blue on the outside certainly, but you wouldn't get all those wonderful blue veins. So what blue cheese producers do, all blue cheese producers do, including those who produce Roquefort, is they needle the cheese. So essentially, you make Roquefort, and it looks just like a plain old round of, it's softer than cheddar, like a Wensleydale. So imagine a Wensleydale, if you've had that cheese before, without the cranberry or without the fruit. You can make White Stilton. White Stilton's a great example. That's what blue cheese looks like before it becomes blue cheese. So it's just a round of semi-soft cheese. And then what the affineur will do is needle the cheese. So literally they're putting small needles through the cheese. And that creates air. And it creates this perfect environment, along with the moisture of the cave and the blue molds you inoculated the cheese with, the milk with. And all that air creates this fantastic blue mold that permeates throughout the cheese, and you get these really nice blue veins. So it's the process of needling that's just as important as anything else in the proper production of blue cheese. Now, Roquefort in particular can just be made in one area, Roquefort-sur-Soulon. Roquefort-sur-Soulon is actually a village, and it could only be aged in the caves underneath the town called Combalou. Pronunciation, again, terrible, but Combalou. So they're specific, only come from a specific area in and around Roquefort-sur-Soulon, and can only be aged in those caves underneath the village. Roquefort is a protected designated cheese from France. You can't produce a blue cheese in the US and call it Roquefort. Much like some of the wines we've talked about in other classes and other parts of other clubs that we've done in the previous month. And it could also be made, or it can't be made with any other milk. So it cannot be made with any other milk other than Lacoune sheep or Lacoune sheep milk. So it has to be from a very specific place, aged in a very specific cave or series of caves, and then can only be made with Lacoune sheep milk. So specific type of breed, specific type of animal, and that's it. Roquefort is kind of probably the most famous blue cheese in terms of widely recognized name, but there are only 7 Roquefort cheesemakers in all of France. That's it. And they're affineurs. The companies who age these cheeses are affineurs. They buy cheeses from various farmers who produce them. But there's only seven companies, 7 producers of the cheese. In the US, you'll find I think I've only ever seen 4 of them that come to the US. I could be wrong, but Society is the largest of all Roquefort producers in France, and you see Society quite a bit in the US. Gabriel Coulet, and then the 2 best, I think, that come to the US are Papillon. A lot of people have seen that and recognize the butterfly on the label, hence the name Papillon. And then Carl's, which is my favorite. Carl's does amazing job. So those are the only 4 I've seen, but there are 3 more: the La Veau Bergère, Fromageur, Ocitane, and I've never seen Ocitane in the US, and Vernier are your other 3 Roquefort producers. But this is Carl's. This is my favorite blue cheese that comes into the US by far. We're gonna taste it now. And what I love about Carl's is it's not Roquefort like Society Roquefort, the producer Societe, I like as well, but it's super sharp, super strong, and then Roquefort rightfully has a reputation of being very strong. But Carl's is so well balanced and has this creaminess that really surprises people. And wow, it just melts in your mouth. And it's got like a warm, fudgy texture. I actually get a little mocha on the finish there. But God, is that good. Man, that's just delicious stuff. Even if you don't like blue cheese, I highly encourage you to try a little bit of the curls. It's not going to be what you expect. If you don't like it after you taste it, of course, that's fine. All this kind of stuff is subjective, but this is the creme de la creme of Roquefort cheese that you can get here in the US that's imported from France, and I hope you enjoy. I would say before I leave this class and before we wrap up, a couple kind of housekeeping things. I should really mention this at the beginning of every class. When you're eating cheese like this, I mentioned this last class, I think, but always bring it up to room temp. Let your cheese sit out for at least a half hour, maybe more. I've had cheese sit out for 2 hours before I serve it. You might not want to do it that long with brie, but certainly with something like the Abondance, it could sit out for at least that long. But you want your cheese to be brought up to room temperature before you eat it. Rewrap your cheese in new wrapping paper every time you take it out and unwrap it. Plastic is fine, it's okay, but preferably cheese paper or parchment or wax paper is actually good. If you don't want to go out and buy cheese paper, which you certainly don't have to, some sort of parchment or wax paper in particular would be perfect. You want the cheese to breathe. Plastic tends to choke it a little bit. There's no room for air. And after a while, it will get a little bit of that plasticky feel to it, but there's nothing wrong overall with plastic. And that's it. So those are my little housekeeping topics. Always bring your cheese up to room temperature. Always rewrap the cheese in new wrapping paper or plastic whenever you use it. I hope you enjoyed this little tour of France. There were some delicious cheeses. I'd love to hear what you think about them. Like us down below, or comment, or give suggestions, or whatever you do for YouTube videos. And I'll see you next month. Thank you so much.